we're coming to near the end here. Just a few more topics that we're going to be covering together, and then you'll need to be diligent on your homeworks, and we'll see if the Lord will allow us to gather in October or not, but we'll pray to that end. Let's see. So hopefully, yeah, you can see file before you. We are, as I mentioned, we're now in the expositional steps of the process, and our focus is on last week we were talking about the sermon concept and outline. So we're going to get back on that particular topic, and just to remind ourselves again, the sermon concept and outline is your main idea for your message and how you outline it. Okay, it may follow the author's what, why, how, but it is different than the author's what, why, how. And the way that it is different is the author's what, why, how is focused on what the author's main point is and his outline. Whereas the sermon concept and outline is directed, so the author's what, why, how is directed to his audience, to his readers. The sermon concept and outline is taking the passage and directing it to your hearers, to your congregation. And so there may be some differences in that. So we talked about last week what makes for an effective outline sermon concept, an effective sermon concept and outline. And these are just a review of the things we covered. Again, it should come from the author's what and why, right? It should be derived from the text, should be memorable, which means try to make it simple, clear, concise. Obviously needs to be connected to the text. And then the key point that we discussed last week was in its context. All right? So just because it doesn't mean we can take a word or a phrase and then run off into our own discussion about that. We need to preach the text within its context. So what did the author mean? And then how does that apply to us? That's very important to remind ourselves of that. We should be directing it to our hearers, not to some audience back in Paul's day or Peter's day or David's day, but it should be directed to our hearers. So that means we need to avoid exegetical statements like David instructs us, or Paul gives 3 commands to. Certainly we can mention those things within the sermon, but as far as our sermon concept and outline, it really needs to be 3 instructions or 3 commands from God to something like that. So we take it out of the author's world and put it in our own. And then the outline points should be connected to your sermon concept, all right? And so we, again, covered that a lot last week. You can look at the notes there to get more details. The most important principle for the sermon concept and outline is that we must be accurate, clear, and memorable, all right? That's our goal. When you come up with your sermon main point, it should be a good, short, concise, but more importantly, accurate and clear. And when you come up with your outline, it's the same focus and emphasis, accurate, clear, and then try to be memorable, okay? But if you can't come up with a good outline, it's always okay to start with the author's what, why, how, and go from there, all right? And so that was just a quick review from last week. Are there any questions, comments before we're going to read the text together and go to the next step? Is everything hopefully clear from that? Sermon concept and outline? All right. Okay. Well, let's read our psalm again together, and then we'll move to the next step, which is drafting the sermon, putting the sermon together. All right. So we'll start with you, Brother German. If you could read verses 1 through 3, and then Ruel, verses 4 to 6. And Kenneth, I'll ask you to read verses 7 through 9.
Let's start. Verse
Yes.
1. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
Okay, Ruel.
The strength of the Lord, verse 4, the strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool, at his holy hill. For holy is the Lord our God.
All right. And then from that, our sermon concept and outline that we derived last week was simply this. The sermon main point was do homage to the holy. That homage has the idea of honor, exalt, even worship. So it captures the exalt and worship command. And holiness, the holiness of God is the driving force of a reason to do that. And then we had the three outline points following, again, the stanza, each stanza from the poem. The first was extol God for his majestic holiness, and second, exalt God for his moral holiness, and finally, esteem God for his merciful holiness. And notice there's only really, even though these outline points are a little bit long, notice that only two words are changed between them. The first word and the fifth word. So hopefully that makes it memorable. And notice holiness is in each outline point, which connects to the main sermon point of that God is holy. And then each is directed to our hearers. Notice extol, exalt, esteem. So these are given in the form of commands. And then finally we have, all these begin with E, and these begin with M, just again to try to help it stick, to keep it memorable. All right? And so this was sort of the outline we came up with. Feel free to steal it if you want to preach this sermon. Since we've done the whole study process together, you can feel free to use that as part of your outline if you would like, if you ever preach this particular psalm. So now that we've got the sermon concept and outline, that's key. This is really the most important part of the sermon preparation process, because this gives you the core of your sermon. This gives you the structure. Now you have the main idea that you'll repeat, that you'll express throughout the sermon, and then you have each sermon point, each outline point. All right? And so what I want to do is just sort of review some important concepts about sermon, what the sermon structure should look like. All right? And so for that, there's three aspects of the sermon preparation. Before we get to that, following the sermon concept and outline, then the next step is to draft the sermon body. And by draft, what I mean is this is not a full manuscript, but it is the step just prior to that. I'll explain that in a few minutes. Now, as we consider preparing for the sermon, there's three parts to this, three steps, three aspects. We want to consider the structure of the sermon, and then writing the sermon manuscript, and then beginning with a sermon draft. All right? Now, sermons from a poetic text is going to be similar to sermons that we preach from an epistle. Because again, remember, poetry, though it is filled with figurative language, still presents truth in a propositional way. It makes declarations, and then how we are to respond to those declarations. For example, in this psalm, right, it talks about the Lord is great in Zion. He's enthroned above the cherubim. And then there's the command, let us praise his great and awesome name. And so that's similar to an epistle. It's presenting instruction, it's teaching, but it's doing it in a more figurative or poetic way. But the sermon is going to look very similar in its structure to an epistolary sermon, to a sermon from an epistle. All right? And so as we think about the structure of the sermon, can anybody tell me, what is a basic sermon format? What does a basic sermon look like? Does anyone want to take a guess at that? Kenneth, what do you think? What would a sermon, how should a basic sermon be structured? What does it have in it?
It should have an introduction, body, and conclusion. Is that
There
what
you
you
go.
mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean. All right. Very simple structure, right? There's an introduction, there's a body, and there's a conclusion. Now, as we talk about the introduction, what is the goal of the introduction? Again, I just want to review some of these things. It's always good to keep that fresh in our minds as to what we're trying to do within a sermon.
Getting the attention of the hearers.
Yeah, first, right? Get the attention of your hearers. Why is that? What do you guys think? Why is this important?
Some of the people who would listen their minds are still not engaged, or need to set their mind toward the hearing of the message.
Yeah, we need to help them in this, right? When people gather together, there often could be thinking about 1,000 different things, right? What happened to them earlier in the morning, maybe something that's going to be taking place later in the day. Maybe they've had a bad week. Maybe their children have been naughty, so they've been disciplining their children, or maybe they've gotten into a fight with their spouse, or been arguing, or maybe they've lost a loved one. Maybe they're just tired. They stayed up late, or they had a long week. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons or potential distractions, right? I mean, think about us. Right now, you guys have come to this discussion, and I imagine that some of you may have the same kinds of things. And so it's important that when people gather, it is our role, our job as the preacher to bring them together, to get their attention. All right. Now, we could do that in a lot of different ways. What would be some bad ways, maybe, or some less desirable ways to get people's attention? What are things that could get their attention, but things we would want to avoid as preachers? What do you think, Ruel? What would be some bad ways to get attention of our hearers?
Probably
Joel
one is
Austin style.
Okay. What do you think, Ruel?
um, GC interrupted me.
Yeah.
Sorry, brother. I repeat.
Probably
Repented.
one thing in my mind is that not able to control your nervousness. People that really would be giving their attention to you in a negative way. The way you handle yourself as you go to the podium or to the pulpit. I think we need to.
So not being nervous, right? Is that what you're saying?
That we probably manage our nervousness. Right?
Okay. All right. Any other ideas? What would be some ways that could get attention from our hearers, but would not be the best way to get their attention?
Maybe Pastor Tim, a humorous illustration, but the people cannot get over with it because it's too funny that that they are so captured with the joke that they cannot move on to the message already.
Yeah, sometimes it's okay to use humor, but sometimes we have to be careful that we don't just tell a joke for the sake of telling a joke, or tell a joke, that is so funny, or that it actually becomes a distraction. That can happen.
Dr. Tim,
Yes.
I think it's to get their attention, it must be an interesting title related to your topic.
Yeah, interesting titles can be a helpful way to gain people's interest, right? Because they may wonder, okay, what is this sermon going to be about? This is an interesting title. There's a pastor in our area. He puts the titles of his sermons on they have a board out in front of the church, and he often comes up with very clever titles. And so sometimes that gets people's interest as they're driving by and say, oh, that's a kind of interesting title. And so it does attract people. I don't know what he preaches on, so hopefully his title actually is consistent with his passage. But
It must.
yeah, it has to be, right? That's a requirement.
You must be, if you give your title, you must be consistent to the body of your sermon so that the people can remember or can I remember what you have preached on that Sunday.
Yeah.
That's why it's a skill of a pastor to do such thing.
Yeah, really.
Under the grace of God by praying.
Yeah, that's a good point. Really, your sermon title can essentially be your sermon main point, right? I mean, that's sort of the idea. To use that sermon concept and you really make that your title of your sermon. That's a way to help it be memorable as well. Okay. Any other? Just looking at. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay.
Oh, any other things that maybe things that would get attention from our hearers, but may not be the best way to get their attention? Any other ideas or thoughts?
Lack of preparation, Pastor Tim.
Lack of preparation. So maybe it gets attention, but perhaps isn't connected to the text.
Yes.
I was listening to a sermon by a well-known preacher, normally a very good preacher, and he just told this long story at the beginning of a sermon, and basically it was a story to get people to laugh. And so he tells this long story about a guy he met in an airplane, and something happened that was funny, and then he shifts to his sermon, but it was completely different. It was on a completely different topic. So he didn't lead us to the text. He just he did get our attention, but it was disconnected from the passage. Brother Ramel mentions if the introduction is too long, we have to be careful of that. All right, does someone have another thought?
How about Pastor Tim, too emotional?
Too emotional. Yeah, we have to be careful about that, don't we? What would be a potential problem with that if it's too emotional? What do you think, Edwin?
I think very long is like Brother Ramil, too long, and then they share about their lives, and then very emotional.
Yeah, we don't want to dominate the introduction
sometimes
so much.
Out of context.
Yeah, it could be taken out of context, or it could if it's not connected to the sermon topic, that could be the people's focus rather than the passage. I remember in seminary, one guy, his introduction to his sermon was a war story, and he tells this war story about it was World War II, and this German and American, this American soldier had trapped a German soldier. They had been under heavy fire, and he chased the German soldier to this location, and the German soldier was hiding behind a tree, and he was injured. And the American soldier came around to the side of the tree where the German was, and he had his gun pointed at him, and he was ready to shoot. And his orders were from the command to shoot for this particular battle, that all enemy were to be shot, no prisoners of war. And so this American soldier, right before he was going to shoot the German soldier, he noticed a cross that the German soldier was wearing. And he asked the German soldier, "Why do you have that cross on?" Well, turns out the German soldier and the American soldier are both Christians. They're brothers in Christ. And so the American soldier has this dilemma. Do I kill? I'm under orders to kill any German. What do I do? And so the pastor tells the story in a really engaging way. I mean, we were all like, he grabbed our attention very well. We were all wondering, and he brings up to the point where he says, so the American soldier, he's faced with this dilemma. Does he kill his brother in Christ to follow orders, or does he let him live? And then he went on to the passage. He didn't tell us the end of the story. He didn't tell us what happened. And so the whole sermon, we're all wondering, what happened? Did he shoot the guy, or what did he do, right? And so the introduction was excellent as far as getting our attention and capturing. He had all of us riveted, listening carefully. But then he didn't tell us what happened, and it was so emotional and so compelling that it distracted the rest of the sermon, because we were all wondering, what did the American soldier end up doing? And he never told us. So that's just one example of sometimes an introduction can be too good, as far as it's either too emotional or it's too engaging, so that it diminishes people's attention when they get to the text. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I don't.
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Yeah. So I think we want to have a good introduction. We just want to be careful that it doesn't dominate the sermon. And so that's one thing to consider. And now we're talking about goals of the introduction. All right. The first goal is, again, gain the attention of your hearers. Again, remember, the introduction is really functions as a bridge between wherever your people are at that are in the congregation, wherever their minds are at, whatever they are thinking about. Your introduction is intended to be a bridge from where their minds are, and you want to bring them to where the passage is. You want to get them thinking about the topic of your text. You want to get their minds focused away from whatever is distracting them and move it towards the passage that's going to be preached. And so that's why a key goal of introduction is to get their attention. But it's not just get their attention in any way that you want. I mean, you could get up there and yell and scream, right? That would get their attention. You could get up behind the pulpit and say, hey, everybody, hey, listen to me right now, right? You could do that. That might get their attention, but you're going to startle them, or that's not moving them to the text. That's just getting their attention. So we want to gain the attention of our hearers, but we want to move them to the sermon topic. Okay? So that means that our introduction needs to be connected to the topic of our sermon in some way. All right? It needs to be linked to what the passage is going to be talking about, because not only do we want to get their attention, but we want their minds to now start thinking about the topic at hand. So if your passage is 1 Corinthians 13, you're going to want to have something in the introduction that's connected to this concept of love, right? Or in Psalm 99, what might be some introductions that we might potentially use? What topic? What is going to be the topic of Psalm 99? What's the focus of Psalm 99? What's its major theme?
Holiness.
Holiness, right? And our main point is do homage to the holy. So what do you think our sermon, our introduction, the topic of our introduction should be on? Right? Same thing. It should be something that begins moving our hearers toward the topic of holiness, or the topic of worship, or the topic of honoring God. I mean, something along those lines needs to be. You don't want to get up there and just tell a joke about about some other particular topic. You want to move them to the sermon topic. All right? And so that's the challenge. Gain their attention, but do so on a topic that's related to the text so that you're moving them from where their minds are, get their attention, and now you're going to take them into the passage. So you're going to move them to the sermon topic and then move them into the text. All right? And if you can do this, you know, an effective introduction also, while you're doing this, surfaces the need or a need in your hearers. What do you think I mean by that? Let me ask, John, are you there? You with us, John? Oh, having trouble hearing you. Are you there, John? Oh, maybe I'm in trouble with this sound. How about you, Eric? Are you online? I mean, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Tim.
Great. Good morning. Let me ask you that question.
Surfaces a need.
Yeah. What does that mean?
For example, if Psalm 99 is the subject is about holiness, so the need is as believers we need to be holy. So the opposite of holiness is sin. So we need to be cleansed by our sins, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. We could have something related to the topic of our need to be holy, or the problem of sin, or maybe because the topic is do homage to the holy, maybe an example of lack of worship, or something along those lines, or an example maybe from a situation where a church or a person is not exalting God, or something along those lines, right? But something that's related or connected to the sermon concept of God's holiness. So that would be surfacing a need. Has the idea of, we want to, in a sense, convince our hearers that this is something they need to listen to, that this is something that will help them, that this passage and this topic is something that is connected to their lives, that that they're going to want to listen to this. So, you might even sometimes even just having questions. Do you ever struggle with holiness? Do you ever feel in your heart that you really want to do the right thing, but you just struggle with doing it? You could bring up questions that cause people to think a little bit and say, yeah, I do struggle with that. That is hard. That is difficult. And so you're starting to get them to think, well, so how do I solve this? How do I deal with it? What's
This is
that?
where we take it to the personal level, Pastor Tim.
Yeah. Morning, John. Welcome.
Morning. Sorry, my audio wasn't working a while ago.
No problem. Yeah, it's this idea of relevance to your hearers. Now, the Word of God is always relevant. The Holy Spirit makes it relevant and applicable. But we can be helpful as pastors in directing the attention of our hearers to the importance of this passage for them. And that's why we want to move from the author's world to the world of our hearers. Because if you're going to talk about something that was happening 2,000 years ago in the ancient Near East, people are not going to feel as connected to that. But they will feel connected to what is happening in their situation in their day. All right, and so that's why if we understand the main theme of the sermon, and then we remember those timeless truths bridge us to the modern day audience, then we can kind of come up with some things that are going to be more connected to their situation. All right, so that's something you want to keep in mind as you're trying to gain the attention of your hearers and move them to the sermon topic. Brother Jess, did you have a comment or a question? Oh. He's thinking. Okay. All right, and then I think finally what we want to do is just for these sermons we want to state the sermon concept, and again that's the main point in your introduction. Okay. Now this is different than narrative. All right. Remember with narrative we talked about in an introduction. Sometimes, remember I mentioned to you there are two types of sermons. One is called deductive, and the other is inductive.
Yes.
You guys remember that? I think we
Yes.
discussed that. We talked about a deductive sermon is basically you give your main point at the beginning and then show it from the text. So you state up front, this passage, Psalm 99, calls us to do homage to the holy. And then the sermon is going to show that. Now, an inductive, so that's something that you would do. A deductive sermon would be something you would do like from an epistle, where you state the main idea up front, or also in poetry. You're going to want to state the idea up front. But for narrative, we might more often do an inductive sermon, and that is that we lead the hearers to the main point at the end of the sermon. So we don't give them the main point up front, but we tell the story, and through the story, we lead them to that main point. All right? So normally, I would say inductive sermons are effective for narrative because that's how narratives work. Usually, the author of a narrative, he doesn't tell you the meaning of the story at the beginning. You have to figure it out by going through the story. And so I think preaching narrative sermons like that is effective, and that would mean inductive. That means lead them to the main point. But sermons from epistles or even poetic texts are going to more be deductive. That is, you give them the main point, the propositional statement, the sermon concept at the beginning, and then you'll show them from the passage how you got that. All right? So that's why so for a deductive sermon, the introduction, you will state the sermon concept. All right? So for a deductive sermon, you would state the sermon concept in the introduction. All right? But in a inductive sermon, you would not tell them the sermon concept in the introduction. You're going to wait. You want to lead them to that. That's the beauty of stories, is that you lead them to the main point. So then they discover it as you're going along, and that can make it very effective. Any questions or comments on that?
How about so Tim, you mentioned last time that for long teachings of Jesus, wherein we apply block diagramming. If you're gonna preach mainly on a specific teaching of Jesus, especially in the gospel where we identify them as narratives, do we do deductive or inductive?
If you're in a narrative, but you're teaching from an instructive text?
That's right.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say you're preaching on John chapter 4, the woman at the well.
14.
What's that? You have another text?
Yeah, John 14, because it's highly instructive regarding the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. So yeah, let's say you're in the upper room discourse, all right, and you're preaching through that. Yeah, that's a lot of instruction. All right. So the form of that is going to be different than a narrative, because what you're going to want to do with narrative is, first, what we do is we preach with a story. We want to preach it as a story, but if within the story there are instructive parts, like the Sermon on the Mount, or many times Jesus would give some form of instruction in the flow of a story. So what my recommendation for that is to teach the story and then come back and, for any of those instructive passages, teach those like you would an epistle, because it's instructional. It's didactic. It's teaching. Whereas in a story, the point of the story is the instructional point, but that comes from understanding the plot of the story. But then within a story, you may have a didactic portion or a sermon portion or an instructional portion. And that part of the story, when you preach, you're going to want to treat that like you would treat an epistle. So what I recommend doing is first preach the story. Usually that will take the whole sermon, and then come back the following week and cover the instructional part of. Now, within the story that we looked at last week, when Jesus was speaking to the woman at the well, do you remember there was one part of the dialogue he had with her where he's talking about this whole issue of true worship? Now, last week we didn't focus a lot on that because we were looking at the story as a whole, but this week I want us to spend some time talking about what is true worship and what did Jesus have to say about that. Okay, now I've set the focus on a part of the story where Jesus gave instructional teaching. And then I will teach through that like I would an epistle, because that is instructional in its nature. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you, Pastor
Then,
Tim.
Pastor Tim, the same with the epistle, if there's a doctrine in the passage that can we separate also that in other Sunday? Next
Yes.
Sunday?
Yeah, I would do that as well, because
Okay.
you'll see doctrinal truths like in the Gospels. Maybe you see a story which shows Jesus's humanity, but that may not be the main point of the story. But that may be a particular doctrinal truth you want your people to notice. And so, what I often see when people preach their narratives is they'll kind of treat the narrative like an epistle, and they'll just take every little sections and then try to find the doctrinal truths and just teach those rather than teach the story. And I say, first, help your people understand the point of the story, and then you can come back, and if there are particular doctrinal truths that are found within the story, follow up on those in the next week. All right, don't try to, because what happens is if we try to teach all of the different doctrines that we see in a particular story, people are not going to understand how to read stories. They're just going to read them like an epistle and say, okay, I'm going to go through the story, but I'm looking for doctrinal truths, as opposed to I'm looking for the point of this story, which is the doctrinal truth the author wants to communicate. There may be lots of other doctrinal truths that we see there, but those may not be what the author's trying to focus on. For example, John 4 is fresh in my mind. That's why I'm using. In John chapter 4, Jesus approaches this well, right, in Samaria. And it says in the text that Jesus was tired. And then he asked this woman for a drink of water because he's thirsty. Now, you could take that and do a whole sermon on the humanity of Christ. Jesus was 100% man. Not only was he 100% God, he's 100% man. And you do this whole sermon on, or a big chunk of the sermon talking about his humanity. And you go through all these other passages that show his humanity. And here in John chapter 4, we see the humanity of Christ, that he was weak, that he was tired, that he thirsted. Now, is it true that Jesus was fully man? Would that doctrinal truth be accurate? It is. Would that be something that would be helpful and important to teach to your congregation?
Yes.
Certainly, of course. The skill is, though, or the important aspect of this is, you don't have to teach it when you're trying to teach them the story. All right? What you can do is first teach them the story. The focus of the story in John 4 is not the humanity of Christ. That's not what John's trying to draw all of our attention to there. What he's trying to draw our attention to is that Jesus is the Messiah, and as the Messiah, he's seeking the lost no matter what culture they are from, and that we are called to do the same. That's the point of the story. So you need to help people figure out the point of the story, and then you can come back in the next week or a couple of weeks and identify certain doctrinal truths that we're seen within the story. Okay? So that what this does is this, is that when you teach the story as a whole, and go scene by scene and tell it like a story and you lead them to the main point of the story, then you're teaching them how to read narrative. Okay? But if you're stopping every verse and preaching on this doctrinal truth and that doctrinal truth, that those may be good points, but if it's not what the author's focusing on, you're going to miss the point of the passage. And you're going to be teaching your people to read every verse in the Bible just like an epistle. Try to find the doctrinal truth in every verse and then focus on that. As opposed to in a narrative, try to find the doctrinal truth of the whole narrative as a whole. What is the point the author's trying to tell us in the story? Find that first. And then, of course, there will be other timeless truths that we see in the passage that you can cover later as a follow-up. Now, if you're in a section like John 13 through 17, I mean, it's all instruction just about, right? I mean, so it's not really, you're not in a story there. You're in a section where there's a lot of dialogue from Jesus where he's giving instruction. So what I would do is, as long as you understand how does that section fit into John's gospel, and how does that fit into the narrative at that point, as long as you remind your folks of that as you're teaching through that instructional section, that would be fine. So, for example, if you're in John 14, you say, let's just remember these last several chapters in John's focusing on the final week of Christ when he was on this earth before the crucifixion. And these chapters are the final focus to draw our attention to the deity of Christ and to the importance of Jesus's ministry. Just sort of give them a general understanding of how John 14 fits into the Gospel of John. And then you could move towards, and this week, Jesus gives particular instruction on the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of the believer. And then you can teach through whatever section you're in there. Okay? But in poetry or in epistles, you don't have to do that. In a poem, it's not, a psalm is not part of a bigger story or something like that. A psalm is a self-contained poem that has doctrinal truth intended for the hearers. And we can treat that poem similarly as we do an epistle. It has got structure, it's got an outline. Each outline point is directed towards the main point. And so we can, in a sense, treat a poem similarly as we do an epistle as far as the structure of the sermon. Now, the things we communicate within that sermon are going to be different than an epistle, because in a poem, there's a lot of figurative language, there's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of emotion and emphasis, things that we're going to draw out from the poem that you wouldn't necessarily have in an epistle. All right? All right, long answer to a short question. Are there any other questions or comments about that before we continue? I lost German. I think he must have fallen asleep on us there. Ah, he's back. Okay. Comfort room break. All right. Okay. Well, hopefully that answers what you were asking. I think it's important as we're preaching, not only do we have some different steps in the exegetical part when we're looking, depending on the genre, there's also going to be some difference in how we approach preaching that passage, whether it's a story or a poem or an epistle or even a prophetic text. There's going to be some style and ways that we approach the passage that are going to be a little different. You know, at the end of the day, we're trying to lead our people to understand the particular doctrinal truth from the text that applies to them. But how we get there depends a lot on what kind of a text it is. And so we've been talking about this with a narrative. If you're preaching a story, you're going to want to bring it to the hearers in the form of a story. Now, if there's a part of that story which is more of an instructional nature, a sermon or a particular teaching, then that part of it, you're going to follow the type of literature that it is and teach that part in more of an instructional approach, like an epistle. Okay? Now, there are some times where you have a poem that's embedded within a story. Jonah chapter 2 is a prime example. And so in that case, you would teach the poem as a poem, but it is given within a certain context. There's a setting to it. And so that takes us back to understanding what is the setting of this particular poem. When was it given? Why was it given? Who gave it? And why did he give it? Who is the audience? So that would apply in that case. So if you're teaching through Jonah chapter 2, you're going to still teach that chapter within the context of the story and how chapter 2 fits in the overall story. But when you go through chapter 2, you're going to preach it as a poem, identifying the imagery, understanding the figurative language, the poetic devices that are used to help bring understanding to the poem. All right? Any questions? Okay, good. Let's continue on in discussing the introduction. Again, for a poetic text, normally your sermon's going to be deductive. That is, you're going to give them the point in your introduction. So your introduction's going to get their attention, move them to the sermon topic, move them into the text, state the sermon concept at the end of your introduction so that you're telling them, okay, this is the main idea here of this particular poem. All right? Now, who can identify or tell us what are some helpful sources that you can use for an introduction? What are some helpful types of introductions?
Stories.
Obviously stories, right? What kind of stories?
Personal or interesting stories.
Yeah, interesting. Biographical stories about people, either yourself or someone else. What's that?
Related to the topic.
Yeah,
The subject.
definitely keep it related to the topic. Like that my friend's story when he was telling about those two soldiers in the war. I mean, that was a biographical account, and it was, it got our attention. People are always interested in stories. It's just, there's something about a story. People tend to, so you start your sermon, the other day I went down to the SM and I met this guy, all of a sudden people are listening. Oh, what happened? You met a guy, and what happened when you met him? So people are already drawn in because you're telling them a story. What are some other helpful types of introductions or sources for introduction?
News clip.
Say again?
Illustrations.
News clip.
Yeah, news clips, current events.
Current events.
Yeah, those can be very helpful. I mean, obviously now a lot of people, their introductions are related to COVID-19 or the impact of that, right? So many
Personal experience.
personal experience, again, is very effective for an introduction.
Another
Serious-
pastor term is it is good asking relevant questions.
Yeah, asking relevant questions. Again, that gets back to, that also helps surface the need. But it can be, asking some questions that say, have you ever, have you ever struggled with your relatives? Anybody here just have certain relatives, certain people in your family, it's just so hard to get along with them, or they just don't like you, or oftentimes when you're together, there's conflict. Does anybody have an issue with that? Anybody struggle with that, you know? And so some people will. And then maybe you could lead into, you know, we're at our family reunion just last year, and my brother-in-law, okay, so you've kind of combined two things now. You ask some questions like to get their attention, and then you tell a story related to those. That can be an effective intro. Any others?
Ako hangin.
Quotes.
Quotes.
Poems.
Yeah, maybe even from famous people or well-known people. Albert Einstein once said that God does not play dice with the universe. Okay, you know, Albert Einstein, well-known person, interesting statement that he made. By the way, Einstein was not a believer. I don't even think he believed in God. He did see the universe as some higher power. So he would call that nature God, essentially, when he would use that term. But that's going to get people's attention. Albert Einstein mentions God, and what did he mean when he said he doesn't play dice? So quotes can be famous, or quotes that are relevant to the hearer's culture or experience. Maybe a quote from President Duterte, or a quote from a famous Filipino, in either in recent or past history. You know, things that will make a connection. I remember listening to one sermon where it was one of the preaching labs. I can't remember which one, where the preacher basically started his sermon saying, "I will return." You know, and I think most people kind of got that. You know, he did that for me, I think, because, you know, it was General MacArthur, of course, and American general. But that got my attention because I remember, you know, that's a well-known quote that we've heard a lot here in our country. And so quotes can be helpful sometimes to quote somebody on something that may be controversial. You know, Gloria Steinem, who started the feminist movement in the United States, at one time said that wives are basically free prostitutes or something like that. It's a provocative quote, and that gets attention. Of course, you don't want to be too provocative. You don't want to be too, you know, you got to be careful about things you say. But sometimes a provocative statement or a surprising or alarming statement can get people's attention. All right. Anything else?
Something about a short drama for only 2 minutes.
I'm sorry?
Dramatizations. A short drama.
A short drama? Is that what you said?
Yeah. At least 2 minutes.
Yeah. What do you mean by a short drama? What are you talking
Relevant
about?
to that is relevant to the message. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of a short drama? Can you give me an example?
Emotional. Yeah. A life experience.
Vengeful.
Say again.
Who will act drama, Brother German?
You mean like acting out?
Yeah. Acting out. Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried this a couple times, and I think it's kind of, you know, maybe you could make something like that work. You just have to be careful, because sometimes it can be sort of what we talked about before. The introduction can sort of dominate the sermon if we're not careful. And so if you do this sort of drama, you know, you might, sometimes it might be more of a distraction, because it's just something you want to be careful with. I did one for one of the epistles that I was teaching through, and it was where I had one of the other pastors pretend to be Tychicus. Okay, remember he was the guy that carried the letters of the Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, and I think I was doing Ephesians. And so as the service began, I kind of pretended that I was a member of the Ephesian church, and this other pastor walked in, and into the sanctuary, and he says, I just addressed him as Tychicus, and we sort of had this dialogue, and I don't know how effective that was. I didn't try it again. I guess I'm not a very good actor, so.
Pastor Tim?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, Sandy.
Other pastors using videos, example, the topic is in time. Before they go to the preachings of the end time, they show some videos, 2 to 3 minutes videos of, in regards to the topic in times. That some other pastors using that kind of introduction.
Yeah, I've seen that too. Videos have strengths and weaknesses. What do you guys think might be a strength of using a video for an introduction?
Catch the attention.
Okay. It can capture the attention, right? Anything else? Anything else?
Memorable. The mind of the hearers.
Visual aids can be memorable.
Easy to remember?
Yeah. Sometimes they can be helpful because they are the time is known, right? It's a 3-minute video or whatever, so you know how much time it's gonna take. So that can be helpful. What are some of the negatives of using videos, like for an introduction or within the sermon? Some things to be careful about or cautious about.
The danger will be they will compare you to the video, and the congregation will compare you to the video.
Then they got here if you show a long video, it could affect the time of your topic.
It could what?
It could affect the time of your topic when you show a long video for your introduction.
Yeah, you don't want to have a long one. What did you say, Eric? I didn't catch. I didn't quite hear you. What did you say?
Maybe Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
the negatives will be the congregation will compare you to the video.
They would what? Compare you?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, if the video is much better than you, so they listen much to the video than you.
Yeah, video
may. A video of someone preaching.
Oh, good. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
The thing that with videos that I always want to be careful of is, videos tend to they tend to make your hearers passive. That is, when you see something on a screen like a video, all of a sudden you go into this viewing mode. When you watch a movie, it's very passive. You're there to be, the movie's there to entertain you. It's going to tell you a story or something like that. And so you sort of just, you passively take it in. That's the nature of videos. So if we do that in a sermon, my concern is that the congregation may become more passive. There's something that switches in our minds when we see a video versus having to listen to somebody tell a story. Also, too, you've got the potential for distraction, because of technical issues. If the sound is not right, or if the video pauses, or if the battery dies on your device, or if the video's blurry, there's all kinds of things that could happen that then become a distraction. And now it's all about, say the video cuts off in the middle, and now you're trying to figure out what went wrong, and you start the video again. Or I remember a guy did this. He was using a video for his introduction, and the introduction ended up taking like 15 minutes, and it was only a 3-minute video because he kept having problems. So he had to start the video 2 or 3 times, and because his sermon introduction depended on that video, he had to show it. And so it really sort of became a big distraction, and he was I'm sorry, let me try to fix it. And he'd start it, and then it messed up, and he'd try to restart it, and it really just became a big distraction. So that's a potential thing to consider.
Pastor Tim, what's your comment about those church that the service on the video?
Oh, the satellite churches.
Yes. The praise and worship is live, but the preaching is in video.
Yeah, it's not ideal. I mean, if the sermon is accurate and clear, that's the important thing. Obviously, if you have a pastor, though, who's not with the sheep, that becomes a big problem in regards to shepherding. So my tendency is to, any local church should have its own leaders who are with the people. And, preaching is an important part of that shepherding process. And so if you have a pastor who's, at another location and he's just preaching a message, it can be good and helpful if it's accurate and clear, but I don't think it could be as effective as if he's there with his people. And because, there is in preaching process, you guys know this who have preached for a while, there is an interaction you have with your hearers. And
yes,
right?
Because I attended that church twice in the province of my wife. It seems yes, the pastor asks question, we need to answer, but we as in the congregation, we cannot respond with this interaction question. Actually, it's true, it's passive. But now is coronavirus. We are preaching in video.
Everybody's on video. So that's why I said, I mean, I'm not against it per se, but I do think it has its negative aspects. And so obviously with the virus, we're in unique times, and so we've had to adjust, but it's not ideal, to be preaching to a camera. And even this, we're interacting with each other, but this is not the ideal. Ideally, I'd rather be with you and spending time together, and and even the dynamic, you're not all able to talk at the same time, right? And the technology is causing some challenges. So it's just different. It's not bad or wrong. It's just not as good. And so, but I think there are other issues with these satellite churches, and because it's really the shepherding part of it, they really need local shepherds, and who are preaching to his people. And I just would favor that myself. But again, I don't think it's wrong necessarily, as long as the sermon is, from the text and it's clear and helpful. But ideally, it's best to be together. And that's even with this virus, it's really hindering a lot of things in our churches, isn't it? That not being able to gather together, some of the gifts in the body are being restricted, hindered. And we understand that. I mean, it's an issue of public health, and so we understand why, but it's still, I think, made it very hard on churches to be able to interact the way God has designed us to interact personally. So, any other thoughts about that? The satellite video sermons, things like that. Anyone have any thoughts? Okay. So, yeah, with videos, just I tend not to use them. I just for the reasons I mentioned, but I don't think they are wrong necessarily. We just have to be careful. I have seen them abused. I've seen pastors rely on videos, probably too much, and what it can do is it sort of can put people in what I'll call entertainment mode. It's like there's something about a video that all of a sudden, okay, now I'm going to be entertained here. And so again, it's that passiveness that I think we want to be a little careful with. All right. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Let's see. We've been talking about helpful sources. Someone mentioned the current events or news clips, obviously, or internet. Books. Books can be a helpful resource. History books, story books, biographies.
Jokes.
Sometimes, I'm going to put sometimes, joke books. Again, you want to be careful. I do have a joke book, but you know what? I think I've used it twice in all the years I've been preaching. So.
How about personal testimony, Pastor Tim?
Sure. Yeah, like we talked about personal experience, personal testimony.
Yeah.
That can be very helpful. Probably the most effective introductions are personal. I think whenever you start with something that happened to you or someone you know, I think that grabs the attention probably more effectively than almost anything else. Because people are interested. They know you. They want to hear about what happened to you or happened to somebody that you know. So we don't want to do too many personal stories, because then it sort of becomes about us. But personal testimonies or illustrations or experiences are very effective. And also too, you can then tell the introduction without having to look at your notes, right? If it's something that happened to you, it can be a very engaging introduction where you don't have to look at notes. You can look at your hearers, because it's a story because you lived it, and so you don't have to follow a manuscript in order to tell it. So those can be very helpful. Sometimes, you know what, you can make up a story. Jesus did. The parables, right? Those were made up stories. They weren't real events. They were real. They were events that could happen in real life, but they weren't actual events that did happen that he was telling. He made them up.
Storytelling, yeah.
Yeah, but they were very, very effective. So you can make up a story too. It doesn't have to be something that actually happened. Now, don't say that it actually happened. That'd be lying. But you could say, one day there was a man who was born with a unable to walk, and and then you can just tell the story, make it up. Sometimes those can be effective too.
Okay.
All right. Any other thoughts before we move on? Sources for introduction.
Oh, how about props, Pastor Tim?
Props. I'm probably.
Yeah, using props.
Yeah, I probably have the same.
I saw.
Go ahead.
I saw one pastor. He brought hammer and nail with him behind the pulpit.
Yeah, I still remember today from our preaching labs, one of the pastors preached a sermon on James chapter 3 on the tongue. And so he brought, in the introduction, he brought this huge cow tongue and he slapped it up on the pulpit. So it was like hanging over the pulpit. So certainly it got our attention. But it sort of became a distraction because he kept it there and it was just kind of, flopping when he'd hit the pulpit, the tongue would sort of flip up and down and we'd make us laugh. And so I do remember it. It did get my attention, but it was sort of a distraction. Again, it's like videos. I'm not completely against them, but I think they can be a distraction if we're not careful. Okay. You may have a prop. I remember I used a prop one time, a water bottle. I was using it as an illustration of what's in the heart, and I shook the water bottle, and then water was in it, and some water came out, and I basically used it as an illustration of, like, in our hearts, whenever circumstances, shake us, what is in our hearts comes out. Okay. And so the problem is when I set the water bottle down on the pulpit, I set it near the edge. And so people told me at the end of the sermon, "Oh, Pastor, I really had a hard time paying attention to you because I kept worrying that your water bottle was going to fall off of the pulpit." And so they spent the sermon kind of, oh, it's going to fall down and make a mess. And so it ended up being a distraction. So props can be helpful, but because they can be a visual aid, and that helps, but you have to be careful. Someone have a comment or question?
About song lyrics, Pastor Tim.
Song lyrics, yeah. Song lyrics. Those can be effective. Now, are you talking about singing, John, or just quoting
No,
them?
just like, quoting them like hymns.
Yeah.
Just quoting lyrics of a song.
I have a couple introductions which are actually the history of a hymn. In fact, one introduction I've used is from It Is Well With My Soul, Horatio Spafford, right? You know that story of how he came up with that song. You guys familiar with that? His family took a trip across the Atlantic, and the ship with his daughters and wife on the ship sunk. His daughters died, and it is believed that he wrote a portion of that song sitting on the ship as it was going over the place where his daughters drowned. So that, and then you can quote from the hymn, and that's can be very effective. Good. Any other ideas for introductions? This is a good list to consider. Now, when you make an introduction, just keep in mind it's important to watch your time. Okay?
Yes.
How long should an introduction be, do you think?
10 minutes.
Okay, we have 10 minutes. What do you guys think?
Depends upon the
3 to 5 minutes.
5.
5 minutes.
All right, 3 to 5 minutes.
Short, make it long.
What, Pastor Jess, it depends upon what? What were you going to say?
depends upon the time allotted for the sermon.
Yeah.
If you are given 3 hours for
What's the usual, Brother GC?
Because Pastor Jesse didn't think about it early.
Again. Naghanag ka bro, ha?
Yeah. My goal, yeah, it kind of does depend on the sermon time, but then it also it doesn't, because again, you want most of your sermon to be about the passage, generally speaking. All right. My target for sermon introductions is about 3 minutes, because my goal is to get their attention and lead them into the text. And so if you're spending 10 or 15 minutes on an introduction, the sermon sort of becomes about the introduction and not about the text itself. So now I do have some introductions where it's longer, but I typically do that for just rarely. I went back actually and looked at a number of my sermons, and I looked at my introductions, and generally speaking, most of mine were about 3 or 4 minutes long. And I think that's enough time to, get the attention, focus on the topic, and move them to the text. All right? Because I want to be in the text. That's my main goal. So there's no rule. It's not like you're in sin if you go more than 6 minutes. But unless it's a really bad introduction, then you just want to get it over with. All right? But there's no rule here. But I think, again, let's say if you have, I target a 50-minute sermon. All right? I know some of you guys go longer than that. Maybe, I guess you're better preachers, so people can listen to you longer. But for me, 50 minutes is kind of my target. So if you think about that, if I spent 10 minutes on a introduction, now I have 40 minutes left. So let's say I have a 50-minute sermon. If I have a 10-minute introduction, that gives me 40 minutes for the sermon and the conclusion. Well, let's say I have a conclusion of 3 minutes. So that gives me, essentially 37 minutes for the sermon. Now, what if I have, 4 sermon points? That's 9 minutes per sermon point. That really isn't a lot when you think about it, particularly if you have a longer passage. So my goal is basically about 3 minutes, 4 minutes on the introduction, and I think usually that's more than enough. All right. If you're good at introductions, then you don't need a lot of time to get people's attention and move them into the passage. Now, sometimes to surface a need or to develop a concern, let's say you want to talk about, you want to do a sermon on anxiety, and you notice people are being very anxious and fearful of this virus, and they're showing too much fear about death. Maybe and not showing enough trust in the Lord. And so maybe you want to spend some time and really develop that issue in your introduction so that you can help them see the need. That's fine to do, but I wouldn't do that every week. You really want to get spend the most time in the text. Okay? Again, no rules on this. That's just sort of my opinion about introductions. Any questions or comments on that? Okay, so let's go to the body of the sermon. And the body of the sermon, again, that should be, most of your sermon should be on the body, because that's where you're actually in the text. All right, and the body of the sermon includes, each outline point. All right, includes, oops. All right, so if you have 3 outline points, you're going to have, point 1, point 2, and point 3. And for each outline point, I don't know if you guys remember the 5 P's. For each outline point, you want to have a point, proof, picture, plan, and problem. All right, so for example, in Psalm 99, we had 3 points, right? The first one was exalt the Lord for his majestic holiness. And then we had exalt, or maybe I got these different, exalt in the Lord for his, and then exalt the Lord for his moral holiness. I think that's what we had. And then finally we had, what was the third one? Let me grab it. Esteem, that's right. Esteem the Lord for his merciful holiness. Okay, so these were our 3 outline points. Now for each of these outline points, within the point, we want a point, proof, picture, plan, and the problem. So maybe I want you guys to help me out here a little bit. So when I say the point, what does that refer to? What am I talking about there?
The main
The
argument.
main points.
Yeah, the outline point.
The
Okay,
subject.
the outline point, the subject of the point. So I'm stating here, for example, if we're on the first point, it's simply this. We see in verses 1 through 3, we must exalt in the Lord for his, or extol, that's what it was. It was extol. Extol, we must extol the Lord for his majestic holiness. So it's basically stating the point. Now, we move from that to the proof, all right, or it's also referred to as explanation and argumentation. What is the proof? What do you guys think? When I say proof, what am I talking about?
You try to prove your point.
Yeah.
Explaining
Reason.
Point.
Explaining
Explain your point.
explaining the point. How did you get the point? How did you get it from the text? What did you say, Kenneth? Proving your point, proving the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. This is where you apply all that you've studied to help the people, help your hearers
Find the
see
truth.
how you got that point from the passage.
Right. Perhaps also it includes the defining the key terms, the important words that you placed in your word study.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean that's where you walk them through. Okay, our outline point was extol the Lord for his majestic holiness. So I'm going to show them from the passage, I want to show them how from the text, what majestic holiness is referring to. What majestic holiness means, and what it means to extol the Lord. Okay, so I'm explaining the point, but I'm essentially proving it. I'm showing it to them from the passage, and it also includes an element of argumentation, meaning the idea of persuasion. Okay, I'm trying to. It's stating, why should you listen to this point and follow it? All right? Why should I extol the Lord for his majestic holiness? Okay? Again, the sermon is not just to convey information, right? It's to call a person to embrace the truths of the passage and then to prepare their heart for action, for response. Okay? A teacher explains the text. A preacher compels to follow the text. You guys understand that? Now, a preacher must also be a teacher. You can't compel someone or encourage or exhort someone to apply the passage if you haven't explained to them what it means. You need to be able to explain the point, and you need to be able to show them from the text so they can see, yeah, okay, I see it there. God is telling me to do this. It's not just, it's not just Pastor German telling me to do this. He's showing me from the passage where God is saying it. And then as preachers, we need to compel, to persuade, to move our hearers to respond. All right? That's what a preacher does. He explains the text and then calls for a response to the text. All right? So that's part of the proof. I'm not only going to prove this point and show it to you from the passage, but I'm also going to try to convince you to do something about it. All right? That's the idea of, we'll get more into that with application, but the argumentation side of it is just sort of that's where that's the compelling, the drawing, the exhorting to consider how that point connects to you as the hearer and what you should do about it. All right. Comments or questions on that? That makes sense? Okay. All right. So
Pastor Tim,
yes, sir.
in the argumentation, it's the way I understand it. Is it more of like giving the general idea of what you would want people to apply in the specific, which is the application part? Like it's sort of like giving them for example, we say, so exalt the Lord for his holiness. And then the application part would be to the nitty-gritty details of life, something like that.
Yeah, and that will come later under the plan. That's the application. Yeah. Here, I'm trying to compel people to embrace what this passage is saying for themselves. I'm trying to persuade them that this applies to you. This isn't just information about God. God is holy. Let me explain to you what holiness is. Let me explain to you what it means that God is holy, or what his majestic holiness is. Okay, that's the explanation part. But then I'm like, okay, so why should this matter to you? Why is this important? It's really compelling your hearers to recognize they have a responsibility to respond. Now, what that response should be, that will come later under application. This is just sort of the why you need to listen to this and understand it and embrace it. Okay.
So the proof section would be the what and the why.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Okay. What is the point? Why does it matter?
Okay.
Maybe I could say that. What is the point? Explanation. And why does it matter to me? Argumentation. And also, too, there's an element of, sometimes you have to convince people of the passage. So, you may need to use parallel passages which explain the same truth, or other supporting texts which also help to give understanding of the meaning of the passage and what to do with it. But I'm just trying to help you see that the proof part of it is not just the teaching aspect, but there's also some element of the preaching aspect. And there's a little bit of overlap with application, but it's not specifically what to apply. It's really more the idea that you need to apply it, that you need to respond to this. Okay? All right. Another element in each outline point is you're going to want to not only state the point, not only prove the point, but also you want to provide a picture, or that is an illustration. Okay? Now the word illustration comes from a Latin word which meant to light up or to enlighten. And so an illustration, really, the point is, point of an illustration is to help the hearer see the truth being explained. Okay? Now, when we think of an illustration, I see illustrations can be used for three different purposes. One is to clarify a particular truth. Maybe it's a difficult concept, and so you're trying to give an illustration to help it make more sense. Okay, but you can also use illustrations to emphasize a particular truth. All right? Maybe the point is obvious. You don't need an illustration to explain it, but maybe an illustration can help emphasize it, why it's important. And then finally, you can use an illustration to make a particular truth memorable. You know, sometimes you will help them if you have a good illustration that they'll remember that attaches to a particular truth from the passage. Okay? So these are three ways that illustrations can be used. It's not just to help a person understand a particular truth or clarify it, but also if you want to emphasize that truth or if you want to help them remember that truth, you can use an illustration to do that. All right? Any thoughts or comments on that or questions? Does that make sense? All right. Sometimes I hear guys mention, you know, illustrations are only to help people understand a particular truth, but I think they can be used for other purposes as well. Because sometimes I hear guys illustrate something and we already understand the point. It doesn't really need an illustration to help us understand it, but sometimes that illustration can be used to give impact or to help us remember it or to emphasize it. Okay? All right. Now, what are some cautions to consider? What should we be cautious about when it comes to illustrations? What do we need to watch out for? What are some maybe dangers? Some dangers regarding illustrations.
Vague illustrations instead of clarifying it. It's sort of.
Yeah, the illustration makes it more confusing, not more clear. Right? Where it's like, what is he talking about? I don't understand. So yeah, we definitely don't want an illustration that sometimes we try to force something because we think it's a cool story. So we try to force it into the sermon and it doesn't fit. So yeah, that's good. What else? Cautions.
Or unfamiliar objects in the illustration. For example, Pastor Tim, you're speaking in a mountainous area and suddenly you're talking about technology and all and something that they cannot relate to or figure out.
Good, yeah. If your audience, your hearers are unfamiliar with what you're talking about, or I've heard that, you know, people start talking about a movie or a book that they've seen and they assume everybody's seen it or heard of it, so people don't know what they're talking about because they've never heard that story or watched that movie. What else? Cautions.
Controversial stories, and then somewhat you give your side, and then the people who hears you some of them, they do not agree with you, and you would hear rumblings among the audience.
Church split.
Yeah.
Charge of experience ba? Charge of experience.
Yeah, that has happened, where sometimes guys use the illustration as an opportunity to give their opinion about a certain controversial issue, and we just need to be careful about that. If we want to deal with something controversial, don't use it as a side illustration. Address it appropriately if the passage allows for that, if it leads to that. Sometimes, too, guys will force a controversial issue because they just want to talk about it, and so they try to make it fit somewhere in the passage, and that's not a good idea either. So be careful. What else? What are some dangers regarding illustrations or things to be careful about? Be accurate. If you're going to tell an illustration about some particular topic, make sure that you're accurate as you tell it, because if you're going to talk about some astronomy illustration, and and if you're not clear, you don't understand it yourself, then there may be somebody in your hearers who does understand it, and when you tell it wrong, they're gonna question, well, does he really understand the passage? If he's wrong about this illustration, what else is he wrong about? So just be careful if you're going to talk about some historical event or talk about some scientific discovery or scientific illustration. If you're going to discuss some issue of politics, whatever it is, make sure that you're representing it accurately. All right, you don't want to undermine the passage because you tell an illustration that was inaccurate. All right. Anything else comes to your mind? Things to be careful of when it comes to illustrations?
Unrelated illustrations.
Unrelated to the topic, you mean, that you're discussing? Yeah. Yeah, sometimes people just want to tell a joke or something, right? You want to make people laugh, but the illustration or the joke's disconnected to the topic. I mean, that's what you're doing then is you're just entertaining. You're not preaching. So we got to be careful about that.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
I also hear, I heard a certain preacher, he told an illustration, but he used a, what I call it, somehow vulgar or obscene language.
Oh.
Yeah, filthy kind of filthy kind of story.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to be careful of that.
Having a sexual connotation like that. I heard a preacher told an illustration like that.
Yeah, that's a good caution, and that's why we want to be careful if you're going to refer to a movie or a book. Make sure the movie is not an offensive movie. Be very careful about that, because some people can say, "Oh, Pastor watched that movie," and you may not have even watched it. You just heard about a certain part of it that you thought was a good illustration, but we need to be very careful we don't what we quote from. But then, yeah, especially don't be careful yourself that you don't say something inappropriate when you're up there. I remember I used a particular word one time that I didn't think was offensive, but there were a couple people in my hearers who were offended by it, and I wasn't trying to be funny. I just made a comment and used a particular word that in some context that they used to be involved in, that it was an offensive word. So they came up and said, Pastor, that word actually can be offensive. Oh, okay, thank you for telling me. So I don't use that word anymore when I preach, even though to me it wasn't an offensive word, but to some people it was. So just want to be careful with that. Cuss words that are viewed by people in the culture as curse words. I mean, you just want to avoid those. Anything else to be careful of? I would say don't embarrass others. If you tell an illustration of maybe from a counseling situation or a personal situation you had with somebody else, you say, well, one time I was counseling this couple and they were struggling with this issue, and just be careful doing that, because if that couple's in your congregation, they'll know you're talking about them, and even if nobody else knows it's them, they're gonna think other people know. All right, so you want to be careful that you don't share information publicly that someone gives to you in private, even if you don't tell their names or anything. It's still something to be careful about. So you might want to change the illustration enough that it won't hurt the feelings of those that are in your congregation. Now, sometimes I'll share illustrations like that when I'm somewhere else. If I'm at another church, I might say, yeah, I was counseling this couple some years ago, and so I try to be careful not to share illustrations of situations for people in my church. So that's something else to consider. Any other thoughts about illustrations, cautions?
About talking about your children, Pastor Tim. One of the struggles of pastors' kids.
Talking about your family members. Yeah, that could be a spouse or kids. Yeah, good. What are your thoughts about that, John?
Being a pastor's kid, I personally didn't experience that, at least not to the, but I've heard a lot of, because during this time I grouped the pastor's kids of Living Word, and that's one of their struggles. When their dad like talks about them, it's kind of embarrassing also.
Yeah, that might go with the good point.
For them, it's like demeaning to them at some extent.
Yeah, and sometimes they just don't want attention drawn to them. So yeah, be very careful. This is
eyes
actually
are on them.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up, John. This is actually important. Just to be careful about assuming you can just use your family members as illustrations, even if it's not a bad illustration. Sometimes this draws attention to them. So something that I tried to do in my preaching is whenever I would use an illustration for my family, I would ask them for permission beforehand. So I would go to my kids and say, I wanted to tell people about the time when this happened. Is that okay with you? Would you mind if I mention that? And I just, out of courtesy, so then they're prepared for that. And they prefer I not mention stories about them, but they understand that it happens. So, but I just want to make sure I get their permission first. And I try not to share too many of those if I can. Okay, so just be careful.
So
Yeah.
in line with that, I happen to use one of my kids as an illustration, because that time I preached about prayer, and I tried to somehow explain to the congregation that even a 12-year-old could develop a meaningful prayer life. And then I shared what I observed from my 12-year-old kid. So using as an illustration.
Were they okay with that, or did that bother them?
When I finish the sermon, my 12-year-old asked, why did you mention my name? But uh, I think that was not an offensive thing to them, but they're just a kind of surprised
Yeah.
because that was the first time I mentioned it.
Yeah, and like I said, sometimes it's not it's not a bad thing you're saying, but go ahead.
Actually, Pastor Tim, that was not planned. It's just popped up in my mind as I went to as I preached.
Yeah, I know that it happens. Something comes to your mind, and you haven't had opportunity to ask your kids about it. I tend to try not to do that very often. Once in a while, it happens, and I think my family's okay with that. But if I did it too much, it would bother them. So I want to be careful about that. Because some of them just don't want that kind of attention drawn to themselves. Okay, well, we spent quite a bit of time here talking about illustrations. Now, in terms of sources of illustrations, it'd be the same kinds of sources you would use for an introduction, right? Stories, personal experiences, current events. You can use songs, you can use quotes, reference to book or movie. All these kinds of things can be used. Just like for an introduction, you can also use them for an illustration. And the same thing with illustrations, you want them to be short. Okay, if you're spending 10 minutes to do an illustration, guess what? People are going to get lost. Now, what was he talking about here? What was the point of this story? So, make sure your illustration is short, okay? When you give it. All right? Okay.
Pastor Tim, how about background in the introduction?
What about background?
Historical or it's part of the introduction also.
Oh, like the background of the text?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. You can include that in the introduction. Often what I'll do is I'll have in my introduction, I'll have like, I'll get the attention. What I typically do with an introduction is I don't often start by reading the passage or praying, because that to me is the most important part of the introduction is the text. And so I don't want to bring that up at the beginning. I don't want to read from the passage at the beginning, because that's when people are most distracted. So I'd rather they be distracted when I'm telling them a story, but not when we're reading the passage or praying. So what I often will do is I'll start with getting their attention, either through story or whatever. So that's how I begin. I get the attention. I move towards the text. I try to surface the need within that. Then I transition to the text, and that's when I'll read it, and then that's maybe when I'll pray for God to provide understanding. And then after that, when I've transitioned to the text, I've read the text, then I might give some of the background. Okay? Sort of like a second introduction, where I'm actually now introducing the passage specifically. At the beginning, I'm introducing the topic of the sermon. I'm getting their attention, I'm drawing them towards the passage. And then I get them to the passage, I transition to the text, I surface the need, then I might give a brief background to the passage. All right, unless we've been going through a book together, so I don't need to focus too much time on the overall context. But here's where I'll give them the background, and then I'll restate the sermon main point, and then get to the body of the sermon.
So, okay. Pastor Tim, when we do our introduction, we will be introducing the sermon and also the text.
Sorry, say that one more time, please.
When we do our introduction,
okay,
we will introduce the sermon or the message and also we will be introducing the text itself.
Yeah, if you need to. You know, it depends. Like I said, if you're preaching through a book, you may not need to do much background. All right, except at the beginning, obviously. But you know, if you're a guest preacher, or if you're preaching a psalm, or you're preaching one passage by itself, then you will need to give them background. But the place that I do that is after I've read the text, and then I'll give them the background to that text, usually.
Yeah.
But I don't do that at the beginning. At the beginning, I want to get their attention. All right? That's my goal right at the beginning. I want to get everyone focused on this particular topic and then move them towards the text and how the text is going to answer or address whatever particular issue or need I've brought up. And then I'll read the text, and then I'll give the background. Sometimes I'll give the background to the text before I read it. It just depends. You know, like if you're talking about some situation, you know, have you ever been in a situation where you're just afraid and you don't know what to do, and you're scared and you're anxious? Well, David was in just such a situation early on in his life. And we read about how he responded to that in Psalm 37. Psalm 37. So please turn there with me to Psalm 37, and then as they're turning, then I might give them a little background. Now the background of this psalm is this, you know, and I'll talk about it, and then I might read the passage. Okay, but I don't do that at the beginning. At the beginning, I'm trying to get their attention. That's my goal. I want to get them away from their distractions, and I want them to be focused on the passage. So that's why I personally don't read and pray at the very beginning, because that's not what I want to use to get their attention. I want them to be fully engaged when we get to the text. All right? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay. Good question. Any other questions before we end our time this morning?
Pastor
Tim.
Hold on a second.
Go ahead, Pastor Sandy.
Yeah, Sandy.
How often you use illustrations when you're preaching?
How often do I use illustrations when I preach?
How many illustrations are you using in your whole sermon? More than one or?
More, yeah. I try to use at least one in every point. So if I have four points, if I have 3 points, then I'll try to use an illustration of some kind in each point, and then sometimes I might use more than one. The sermon I'm preaching this Sunday, total illustrations I've got basically a sermon is just 2 outline points, but I've got maybe 5 or 6 illustrations.
It could be necessary. What do you think?
Oh, what, like, is there a certain requirement?
Yeah.
Is it necessary to
do that?
No, I think, you know, that's going to come with just your experience and what you think is needed. And so as a general approach, I try to have at least one illustration for each outline point, but you don't have to.
Yeah, maybe it depends upon the situation.
It depends, you know, and sometimes, again, sometimes a particular point is very clear. You don't need to illustrate it.
Yeah.
Other times, though, you might want to really emphasize a point, and so you'll give 1 or 2 or 3 illustrations to really emphasize. Like Jesus, at times, he gave more than one parable. Depending on the situation, he sometimes gave multiple parables to make a point. So that's just going to come with your experience. But generally, I try to have one illustration for each outline point if I can.
I observed Charles Spurgeon, Pastor Tim. He used plenty of illustrations when he preached.
Yeah, he did. And a lot of times his illustrations were very short. It's either a quote or 1 or 2 sentence picture.
Even ours is full. There's a
but
lot of
very
illustration.
powerful.
Yeah. And that's a good point too, by the way. If you want to learn how to use illustrations, then I think, listening or reading good sermons can help you teach that. And the Puritans are really good at illustrations, really good. Thomas Watson, very good at illustrating, using word pictures. He was one of the best. Obviously, Jesus, see how he would illustrate things. And he often used everyday events to illustrate a point that he was making.
Mm.
Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yes, sir.
what is your thought on uh, John MacArthur's move?
Oh, with yeah, I was wondering when you guys are going to ask me that.
The governor, yeah.
Yeah. I got to make sure though